Hi there, I'm artist Tracey Capone, and welcome to my tutorial showing you step-by-step how I created this heart-shaped paper cutout effect in Affinity Designer for desktop. Let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I want to do is set up a new document. I'm going to go up to File and select New, and I want to note something here about setting up your document. If you were working with just flat vectors, in other words, there's no raster elements involved, those are infinitely scalable, so the document size doesn't matter. But in this case, we're going to be adding some of this texture using our pixel persona, which means raster elements are involved. So we need to take that into consideration when setting up our document and size the document to the largest size we would plan to print. And that will help us avoid any pixelation or muddiness with texture. So I'm going to go ahead and select a 10 by 10 canvas here. And I want to make sure my DPI is at least 300. That's the minimum that you want to select if you plan to print anything. I don't need an artboard, so I'm going to keep that unchecked. And I'm going to make sure transparent background isn't checked, and I'll click Create, and now I have my document in place. Before I begin building any of my shapes, the first thing I want to do is get my color palette in place, and there are a couple of ways that I can do this. In the downloads that I included underneath the video, I've included the AF palette file that you can import into your document, which will give you the exact palette I used for this illustration if you want to use it. And I'm going to show you how to do that. Now, just a note, if you're following along with your iPad on this, unfortunately at this point, there's no way to import a palette file into Designer for iPad, but I am going to show you how to manually pull that in. So we'll do that in a moment. Let's first go ahead and import. So I'm going to go to my Swatches Studio over here on the right. If you don't see your Swatch Studio, just go to View, Studio, and just check Swatches. I'll go to the burger menu at the top right, and I'm going to select Import Palette. Now it's giving me the option of Application Palette, Document, or System Palette. Now in this case, I don't need this palette for any future documents, so I'm just going to select Document Palette. If you wanted to be able to save the palette and use it in future illustrations, you could go ahead and select Application Palette. So I've selected Document Palette, and I'm going to go to where I saved my AF palette file. I'll click on it to select it, hit open, and now the palette is in place and you're ready to go. But again, what if you're either following along with your iPad or you want to use a completely different palette? You can actually sample colors from photographs or palettes that you find on Pinterest or on Adobe's color site, which I've linked below. Let me go ahead and show you how you can manually pull that in. I'm going to go ahead and delete this palette, and we're going to start over again. The first thing I want to do is set up a blank palette for myself. So I'll go back to the burger menu. I'm going to select Add Document Palette, and now I have an empty palette that's ready to add swatches to. Now I could rename this if I want, but since it's specific to this document, I'm not going to worry about it. If you'd like to rename yours though, just go to the burger menu, tap Rename Palette, and change the name to whatever you'd like. So the next thing I need to do is pull in the image file that I'm going to sample my colors from. Now again, in the downloads that are below, I provided a PNG file with these exact colors in it that you can sample. So I'm going to pull that in to sample from, but again, if you want to use a completely different color or palette rather, just pull in a photograph or pull in a palette from some other source. Either way, the process is exactly the same. I'm going to go to File, Place. I'm going to find the image file that I want to place. In this case, I'm going to select this PNG file and I'll click Open. Now I've got this little icon with the down-facing arrow, and that's telling me that I can drag to place or I can just click on. So you can either click or drag your image into place, and now I'm ready to start sampling it. I just want to deselect this by clicking outside of it, because if I keep it selected when I start sampling the colors, as I add swatches, it's going to change the color, and I don't want that to happen. So the next thing I want to do is make sure that my stroke here is off. I don't need a stroke on any of the elements that I'm adding to this illustration. So I'm going to click on it. It's this little circle that's empty, and I'm going to click the null sign next to it. And that's turned that off. And I'm going to click on my fill here to make sure it's on the top. The palette is populated with swatches based on whatever color is showing in the fill. So you need to make sure that the fill is the one on top here when you're sampling your colors. Okay, I'm going to grab my eyedropper tool here, and I'm just going to drag it across, And I'm going to start with this dark red color. So I've dragged it and I'm going to wait until that circle is the same color and release it. And now if you go up to this little circle here, you'll see it's the same color that I just sampled. Well, as I just mentioned, the swatch palette is populated by whatever's in the fill. Well, right now that's white and I need it to be this color. So I'm going to click to change it. And now I'm ready to add it. So I'll go into my palette here and I'm going to click on Add Fill. And now it's in my palette. I'm going to do that with each of the colors in this document. So again, I'm going to go ahead and grab my eyedropper tool, drag across to select, release. I'm going to click the button to change the fill color to whatever's in there. And then I'll go ahead and select Add Current Fill to Palette. I'm going to go ahead and do that for all of the colors in my document until I have all 7, including the gray, in my palette. Okay, I have all 7 pinks and reds, as well as the gray, and I'm ready to start creating my shapes. Now, I don't need this document anymore, so I'm going to go ahead and select it, and I'm just going to delete it. Now I'm going to add my gray background like I have here, and I'm going to do that using the rectangle tool. Designer has a number of pre-built shapes over here in the tools section. So you have your rectangle tool, a circle, a rounded rectangle, and if you click on this little arrow here, there's a number of other tools, and we're actually going to use that to create our hearts in a little bit. But I'm going to start with my rectangle tool. And before I start dragging anything out, there are a couple of things that I want to check. First, I want to make sure that my fill is gray because that's what my background color is going to be. And if it's not, I'll just click on the gray in the swatch palette. I also want to make sure that snapping is on. Snapping is going to help me easily place the rectangle across my canvas without having to do a lot of manual moving. And I'll show you what I mean in a second. So I'm going to go up here to this magnet. I'm going to click on the drop down and I just want to make sure that enable snapping is on. It is, so I'm all set. I'll click outside of that to close it. Now I'm going to start dragging from the top left here. And I'll just drag out my rectangle. And when I slow down here, if you watch the bottom right corner, because I have snapping on, it's going to snap into place. And when I release, it's all set. I don't need to do any finagling to get it onto the canvas. It's in place. Now I want to lock this so that I don't accidentally move it when I start adding my hearts. So while I still have it selected, I'm going to go over to my Layer Studio. And again, if you don't see your Layer Studio over here, just go to View, Studio, and select Layers. I'm going to right click on that layer. I'm going to click Lock. And now if I grab my Move tool over here, this arrow, I can't move that around. That way it's not going to move whenever I'm adding my other shapes to it. So speaking of the other shapes, we're ready to start adding our hearts. Now there's a couple of ways that you can do this. You could use your pen and pencil tools if you wanted more of a hand-drawn look. For the purposes of this tutorial though, just to keep it easy, I'm going to use the shape tool again. So I'm going to select this heart tool. And again, if you don't see the heart, just click on the little arrow here and you can select from this list of shapes. Now I'm going to start with the lightest color and work my way down to the darkest. And the way I added it to my palette is actually in that order. So I'm going to start from this right pink color here and work my way left. So I'll go back to my other document. I'm going to select this lightest pink so that my fill is light. And I'm just going to drag out a heart. Okay, I like the size of that. I like the shape and width. So I want to go ahead and I want to make sure that it's in the center of the canvas. So I've grabbed my Move tool, which is this arrow, and with it selected, I'm just going to drag it until I see it snap into place. And it's going to have this green vertical line and red horizontal line when it's dead center on the canvas. So now I can go ahead and click out of it and it's in place. Now at this point, we want to start duplicating this heart and dragging it inward, reducing the size of the heart as it goes in. And we're going to do that very easily using Power Duplicate. I'm going to show you how to do that. So I'm going to click my heart, and the first thing I want to do is duplicate it. So I'm going to use the shortcut Command J. It would be Control J on a PC. And you can see in my Layer Studio, there's another heart sitting right on top of my original one. I'm going to go ahead to the next color in my color palette. I'm going to change the color while it's selected. Now I want to reduce the size so that it's slightly smaller than this lighter pink heart. So with it selected, I'm going to hold down the Alt and Shift to keep the proportions the same, as well as have it sized down from the center. And I'm just going to start dragging inward, and you can see it's dragging in from the center of the heart. It's also keeping its proportions. And I'm going to drag it to where I want. I think I'm going to stop right about there. Now I'm going to release the Alt and Shift as well as my mouse. However, I'm not going to deselect the heart. And the reason I'm going to do this is because I'm going to use the power duplicate function. As long as I have this shape selected, I can continue selecting Command J, and it's not only going to duplicate it, but it's going to size the heart down the same amount that the last one was. So you can see that when I hit Command J, I have this outline here, and I can just go ahead and change the color. And I can keep doing that and changing the color until I have all of my hearts in place. Okay, so I have all 6 colors in place. Now, I want to kind of move these around a little bit. I like them, but I think this needs to be a little smaller, and I need a little bit more room on that one. So with this one selected, again, I'm going to hold the Alt and Shift key down, and I'm just going to drag in a little bit. And I'm going to select this one, and I'm going to do the same thing, just a little bit. And I'm dragging from the center so that I don't lose the proportions. And I think I'm just going to do a little bit on this one. Okay. So I like how that's looking. I like the distance. I'm not worried that they're not exactly the same between each one, because that gives it that kind of illustrative effect. I don't want it to be perfect. So we have our flat vectors and shape. Now I'm going to show you what I was talking about earlier. If you watch, I can size this document all the way up to a crazy percentage, like 16,000%, and you'll see no pixelation here. Again, because these are flat vectors, they're infinitely scalable, which means that I can scale up to the largest size possible, and I'm not going to have any sort of pixelation. Let me go ahead and get back to a full screen mode here. So we have our heart shapes in place. The next thing I want to do is start adding some of this shadowing here to give it that kind of cut paper effect. I'm going to add it to my first layer here, and then I'm going to duplicate that across all the rest of my hearts. I'll show you what I mean. So I selected this heart, and I'm going to go down to my layer, the bottom of my layer studio here, to FX, click on it, and I want to add an inner shadow to this. So I'm going to click on inner shadow. If you don't see the menu over here, just click on inner shadow and the menu will show up. Now I'm going to start adjusting some of these settings until I like what I see. Now, because of the angle of this, you're going to see the shadows start coming in from this side. So let me show you what I mean. I'm going to move the offset up, and you can see that my shadow is coming in up here. I don't like that. I actually want it to be more like this one and have it down at the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead to the angle here, and I'm just going to move this probably to about, I'd say 110. And I can move this later if I want to, but for right now, I think I'll stick with probably 110 or 114, we'll say. So what I like about this is there's a little bit of shadow, here's a lot of shadow here rather, and a little bit over here. And if there was a light source coming from this bottom right corner, that's actually how that would work. You would have a little bit of shadow here on the bottom left, but the majority of it would be here. So I like how that looks. I just want to go ahead and make it a little bit blurred to give it more of that kind of shadow effect like we have here. So I'm going to drag my radius up, and you'll see that the shadow starts blurring. And I think I like it right about there. I might bump the intensity just a little. And you can just play around with these settings. You change the opacity. Now, because the blend mode on this is on multiply, what that's doing is allowing the shadow to be in place, but it's also allowing that pink color to come through. It's not opaque, it's kind of blending with the bottom. So whenever you're working with shadows, multiply is the best blend mode for that. Okay, so I like how this is looking. I'm going to go ahead and close that. Now, I don't want to have to do that same thing for the rest of the layers. So I'm going to go ahead and with this selected, I'll go to Edit and select Copy, or you could do the keyboard shortcut. I'm going to click on this next heart and then hold Shift down and click on the last one to select all 5. Now I'll go back up to Edit and I'm going to click on Paste FX. Now that same shadow in the same amount has been added to all of my hearts. So I like how that looks, but it doesn't exactly have that paper feel, and that's where the texture comes in. So let's go ahead and go to our pixel persona. This is at the top left here, and this is where we're going to start adding our raster elements. So when we start adding these, this is where it's really important that you make sure that your original document is sized up to the largest size you want to print, because these are not infinitely scalable. So I'm going to go ahead and use the paintbrush tool, but the first thing I want to do is select the type of brush that I want to use. I'm going to go to my brush studio over here, and if you don't see brushes, again, just go to View, Studio, and select brushes. There are a number of brushes built into Affinity Designer. I'm going to use the texture brushes, and you can find them by clicking on the name here, and there's a number of brushes that you can use. I'll just select textures. There's no names here, but if you hover over the brushes, the names will pop up. I'm going to scroll all the way to the bottom, and I want to use brush pattern 4. And I'm going to start by adding texture to my gray background. So the first thing I want to do is go to my swatch panel, and I'm going to select that gray color, and I want to make sure it's in my fill. I'm going to turn my stroke off. And I want to make that a little bit darker. Actually, I said stroke, but it's not really a stroke because we're in the pixel persona, but I want to make sure I'm going to use this front color here. And I want to make it a little bit darker. So I'm going to go to my color studio. Again, if you don't see it, just go to the view menu and grab it from the studios. And I'm going to move this up to darken that color because I want the texture to be a little bit darker than the base color. So I don't like the size of this brush. It's a little too small. You can see it in the circle here. I'm going to use my bracket key, and my right bracket is going to make the brush larger. I'm going to stop about there. Now I want to go over to my layer studio, and I'm going to click and select the rectangle layer. The reason I'm doing this is because whenever you use a pixel element in Designer, it's automatically going to add a layer to the layer that you're adding it to. So it's the pixel layer is laying on top of the original base layer. So if I tap in here in the gray, you can see this assistant pops up. And if you look in your layer studio, there's a little drop down, and underneath that rectangle tool, or rectangle layer rather, because I had it selected, it automatically clipped a pixel layer to it. Now I can start drawing with my texture brush and adding texture to the whole thing, and I'm just going to follow it around. Now, this is not the kind of brush that builds up, so as you go around, it's not going to add more, but I'm going around a second time just to make sure that I got everything, that I didn't miss any spots. Okay, that looks good. I think what I might do, though, is make this just a little bit darker, and I'm going to go around one more time with a slightly darker brush. So I just want to go, I'm not going to hit the whole thing with this darker brush. If you look at any sort of construction paper, you're going to see that it's not evenly, the texture is not evenly distributed. You have some light and dark values throughout. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Now I want to go ahead and use that same multiply blend mode that we used for the shadows here. So with that pixel layer selected, I'm going to go up here, click on where it says normal, change it to multiply, and it's going to get really dark. And one of the things I'm noticing is I missed a little bit here. So this kind of helps me see where I may need to add a little bit more. Now this is too dark. I actually want it to be a lot less opaque than that. So I'm going to go to my opacity, and I'm going to drop that to probably about 45, maybe I'll go with 43. And you could play around with the settings. If you want yours a little bit more subtle, you can do that. I think with the gray background, I'm going to make it a little more subtle. So I'm going to go with 30%. Since I use that really dark color, I can drop the opacity pretty low. All All right, so I'm good with my gray color. I want to do the same thing to each of these layers. So again, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to change my swatch color to this really light pink. I want to go to my color studio and just darken it slightly by dragging the slider here, and you can see this dot change color. I'm going to click that heart. I'm going to tap in it to add the pixel layer to it. It's automatically clipped. And now I'll start adding the texture to it. And let me just zoom in. It's a little bit harder to see this texture. So you can see I'm adding texture to that heart shape there. And I'll just work my way around. And if you want, you can add a slightly darker color. I think I'm just going to stick with this. I don't want it to be too dark. I just want it to have a paper feel. But again, I'm going to go ahead and change that to darken, and you can see that it already darkened it for me. And I'll just knock the opacity back a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to go through the rest of this, and I'm going to do the same exact thing, adding first by selecting the swatch, changing the color a little bit, tapping into the layer, and then adding my texture. So I'm going to speed it up at this point, but I'll see you on the other side. Okay, so I've added my texture to all of my layers, and at this point I would pretty much just go into each of them and just make sure that I haven't dropped the opacity too much or they're not too high. Now when I got to these layers right about here, I actually just, instead of darkening the existing color, I used the next color in succession because that actually added the perfect color to it. So for example, for this orange layer, I just selected the red, and that's what I used to add the texture. For this dark red, I added the really dark red, and that's what I use to add the texture. So sometimes you can just play with the other colors in your palette, especially if you're using a really great palette that has complementary colors. They work perfectly as the texture for the other. So I've gone ahead and done that. I think all of my texture looks good here. This one could probably be bumped up just a little bit in opacity. It's a little too light, but I don't want it to be too much. Again, it's supposed to be a subtle effect that kind of gives it this construction paper feel. Now, what if I wanted to make a change to the shadow on all of my layers without having to go into each one? Well, I could select all 6 of my heart layers here. So I'm going to tap on my first one, and I'm going to shift click on my last one here to select all of them. And I'll go to my FX studio here, and I'm going to just play around with the inner shadow here. And you can see that it's changing all of them. So if I wanted to change the angle to something else, maybe make it a little bit different there and change the offset and knock it back just slightly, I can make a change to all of my shadowing there all at once without having to start with one and then copy and paste into the others. So I like how this looks. It has that subtle paper effect. The shadowing is giving it that depth that I'm looking for. And I really like the top here where it kind of looks like it's got a touch of shadow here and just enough to make it look dimensional. If I wanted to, I could add lettering in here. I could go back into my designer persona and grab my pen and pencil tool and add some line drawings into it, or I could leave it just as is and print it. Whatever you want to do with yours is totally up to you, but this is how you can start with your base of a faux cut paper effect in Affinity Designer for desktop. So if you like this video, please go ahead and give it a thumbs up. And I plan on posting a lot more tutorials, not just in Designer, but the entire Affinity suite, both iPad and desktop, as well as the Adobe suite and Procreate. So be sure to subscribe and click the little notification button, and that'll let you know whenever I post a new YouTube video. Thanks so much for stopping by my very first YouTube tutorial. I appreciate it, and I'd love to hear any questions or comments that you have. Thanks, everyone.